In this video, I want to go over managing tables in KDB.AI. We're going to learn how to create a table, insert some data, query this table, and then finally delete when we're done. Now to get started, you need your API. And to do that, you go to KDB.AI and you log in, and this takes you to the dashboard. So the dashboard has a lot of cool stuff. We can look at our memory, see how much memory we have left. We have some code snippets, we have some tutorials. But what's important here is the connection details, right? We have our endpoint URL and we have our API keys. Now, if you don't have an API key yet, you could just click this Add API Key button. But I already have my endpoint and my API key, so I'm ready to get started. Before I do, there's some other cool stuff here. We have our tables. We could delete them if you'd like. We have our sample applications. You could join the Slack community. Generally, the dashboard has a lot of resources for you to get started. Now let's go straight to the code. First thing we're going to do is install the KDB.AI client. This allows us to connect to our database. I already have it installed, and we're going to import some packages. The only one that matters here is the KDB.AI client. Now let's connect to KDB.AI. For this, we need our KDB.AI endpoint and our API key from earlier. And then we could connect to our session. Now, when you get started with KDB.AI, you get a default database. Now, with KDB.AI, you could have multiple databases, and each one of these databases can have multiple tables. This is just an architectural decision that we've created to make it easier for users. Now, the first database that you have when you're starting out is the default database. You could always connect to that. You could create some tables inside the default database. If you'd like, you could create your own database. If at any point you need help understanding function, you can use the question mark operator. So here, let's explore KDB.AI session. What we see is that it requires an API key in it. Now, let's just make sure that our database doesn't already have a table called data. And if it does, we're going to drop it or delete it. And then we can look at our tables. Okay, we don't have data, but we have all these other tables. And if you're just getting started, you probably won't have any tables. So let's just ignore this. All right, it's going to be an empty list. So next, let's define our schema. Now, when we create a table, we need two things. We need our schema and we need our indexes. Our schema is going to have two columns. It's going to have an ID, which is going to be a string, and it's going to have some vectors, which are floats. Our index name is going to be flat index, and that's because it's subtype flat. It's a flat index. And now, another thing to note here is the params. We have 8-dimensional vectors, and our similarity metric is going to be L2. We have everything we need to connect to our database. So, we have everything we need to create a table. So let's create a table called data with our schema and our indexes. And next, we have to add some data to this table. So let's create some vectors. And what we're going to do in this example, just to demonstrate, is to create some synthetic data, which means we're just going to create some random vectors. But in practice, we'd be using an embedding library like fast embed or sense transformers to generate our embeddings. And here are some example ID values. Now that we have all our columns, we can create a data frame with this data and visualize it. Let's look at our embeddings. Okay, so we have our IDs, we have vectors, and now we can insert that data into our table. Okay, we've inserted all of our tables. And now we could query our table. Okay, so we've created a table. This just returns everything that our table has. And now we can search our table. So in order to search our table, we need to turn our query into a vector. Let's say our query is a question, like, where was the author born? Well, in practice, we'd use an embedding function or an embedding library to turn that into a vector. And then we would search with that vector. But here, we're just going to create a synthetic vector, and we're going to return 2 results. And what we get is similarity, or here it's called n distance, but really it's semantic similarity. We have the ID and we have the vectors. And this makes sense. The vector return is very similar to the vector we have here. It's only off by 1. Okay, that's everything you need to know to get started with tables in KDB.AI. And the last thing we're going to do is we're going to delete our table to conserve resources. Now, you may have noticed that I've forgotten to do it in this step, because when I showed all my tables, all these tables were just random tables that I forgot to delete. And this just isn't great, because this is costing money, because what's happening is that we're using KDB.AI Cloud, right? So in practice, this is just data that we're managing, which should just have been deleted, because I'm not using a lot of these anymore. But anyway, that's how you get started with KDB.AI. Sorry for the tangent, and looking forward to seeing you in the next video.